It was 20 years ago today that a Bakersfield vice principal committed one of the most notorious crimes in Kern County history.
For the Harper family, July 6, 2003 began like any other Sunday. Church, laughter, the simple joys of family. But by the end of that day, all five would be gone. The question wasn't just who could do this, but why. And the most chilling answer of all, the killer was hiding in plain sight. To unravel this tragedy, we must first understand the lives shattered that day, starting with a woman whose kindness touched everyone she met. Joni Harper. Joni Harper entered the world on November 14, 1963, in the warm, sun-baked city of Bakersfield, California. She was the fifth and final child of Ernestine Harper, growing up alongside two brothers and two sisters. Her life remained rooted in her hometown, where she went to McKinley Elementary and later completed her education at Bakersfield High, receiving her diploma in 1988, a few years behind schedule, but who's counting? Joni excelled in athletics and took part in several sports, though basketball was where she truly stood out during her time at Bakersfield High. Following graduation, she enrolled at Southwestern Christian College in Texas and earned her associate degree. Her connection to the sport remained strong, and she eventually transitioned into officiating games, making history as the first woman in Kern County to referee boys basketball. A whistle and a rule book became her new uniform, and she wore both with pride. In 1994, Joni took on a role with the North Bakersfield Recreation and Park District, where she began working as a game official. Her journey later extended to include officiating within the California Collegiate Athletic Association. Throughout her time on the court, Joni became a familiar and respected figure among both fellow officials and the youth athletes of Bakersfield, earning admiration in a place where whistles usually invite groans. Though basketball held a special place in her heart, those closest to Joni often said her deepest joy came from supporting and guiding children. That generous spirit wasn't hers alone. It was a quality she clearly inherited from her mother, Ernestine. You could say compassion ran in the family right alongside a decent jump shot. Guided by her strong Christian values, Ernestine held a firm belief that fairness and justice should be extended to every individual, regardless of background, appearance, or financial standing. Her view was simple. Everyone deserved dignity. It's the kind of philosophy that sounds obvious until you realize how rare it actually is. In time, Ernestine helped establish a group called Extend a Hand for Justice, driven by her commitment to making a difference beyond her own neighborhood. Her efforts didn't stop at home. She later served as a missionary in parts of Africa and South America, offering financial aid and essential supplies to communities facing extreme hardship. Her passport collected stamps, but her mission always stayed the same: give where it's needed, even if the thanks come in the form of a smile and a borrowed pen. With a spirit as generous as hers, it's easy to see where Joni got her kindness. Ernestine truly led by example. Though she had 5 children in total, her connection with Joni stood out and only deepened as the years passed. When Joni stepped into motherhood herself, Ernestine was right there beside her, offering love, guidance, and the kind of support only a mom with a heart of gold and maybe just a touch of superhuman patience could give. During the late 1990s, Joni was introduced to Vincent Brothers, and the two soon began a relationship. Vincent had grown up on Long Island but made his way to California in the 1980s to pursue higher education. He eventually earned a master's degree in education from Cal State Bakersfield, proving that while geography can change, student loans tend to stick around. Joni's loved ones recalled that Vincent came across as kind and thoughtful, and it wasn't long before she developed strong feelings for him. He had gone through at least 2 prior marriages and was already a father, but professionally, things were on the rise. He held a position at a nearby elementary school and steadily advanced, eventually taking on roles in school leadership, including principal. On paper, it all looked promising, and we all know how reliable paper can be. In 1998, Joni and Vincent welcomed their son, Marcus, into the world. 2 years later, in January 2000, they officially tied the knot. From the outside, it all looked picture perfect, like a storybook beginning. But as fairy tales often remind us, appearances can be impressively misleading. Things between Joni and Vincent unraveled quickly. He would vanish for several days without any explanation, and when he eventually returned, his answers were vague at best. It didn't take long before Joni began connecting the dots and came to the painful realization that her husband was being unfaithful. Just a month after their vows, the marriage came to an official end. Some stories don't need chapters. They close themselves before the ink even dries. Their story didn't end with the annulment. Joni still cared deeply for Vincent. Her brother would later say she considered him the great love of her life. Wanting him to play a role in their son's upbringing, she chose to keep him in her life. The two continued to see each other, and in time, Joni learned she was expecting again. This time it was a daughter whom she named Lindsay. Love, it seems, has a way of lingering even when the fine print says, "Caution advised." Following Lindsay's birth, Joni and Vincent maintained an unpredictable relationship marked by periods of separation and reconciliation. During that time, Ernestine had moved in with Joni to lend a hand with raising the children. After spending a couple of years apart, Joni and Vincent eventually made the decision to marry once more. Sometimes hope is stubborn, and romance has a short memory. Toward the close of 2002, the couple learned they were expecting another baby. With that news, and nearly 3 years after their initial wedding, Joni and Vincent quietly exchanged vows once again in January 2003. But within just a few months, by the time spring arrived, their relationship had already begun to unravel. It seemed even a fresh start came with familiar endings. Old habits had resurfaced, and Joni found herself deeply unsettled. She even shared with a close friend that she feared Vincent might try to remove her from the picture entirely. 4 months after their quiet remarriage, Joni gave birth to their third child, a son she named Marshall. But by the time he arrived, the second attempt at marriage had already reached a breaking point, proof that history has a habit of repeating itself, especially when no one changes the script. Joni made a genuine effort to repair her marriage, hoping to create a stable home for her children. She still believed in the idea of marriage and wanted it to work, but over time, it became increasingly obvious that she and Vincent were not meant to be together. Tensions at home grew worse, especially between Vincent and Ernestine, who was still living with her daughter. Their frequent disagreements eventually led Vincent to move out and get a place of his own. Sometimes, distance isn't just helpful, it's necessary for everyone's sanity. Despite the separation, no legal steps were taken to end the marriage, and what remained of their romantic connection after Vincent left the home was uncertain. Whatever it was, it seemed to exist in a gray area, somewhere between unresolved feelings and unspoken goodbyes. Church played a central role in the lives of both Joni and her mother. The Baker Street Church of Christ was more than just a place of worship. It was a second home filled with familiar faces and heartfelt support. So when Marshall grew old enough, Joni was excited to bring him to meet the congregation. For her, it wasn't just about tradition. It was about family, faith, and a few proud smiles in the church pews. On the morning of Sunday, July 6, 2003, Joni headed to church with her mother and all 3 of her children. Marcus had just turned 4, Lindsay was nearing her 2nd birthday, and baby Marshall was only 6 weeks old. It was a typical Sunday for the family, one filled with faith, familiar faces, and the quiet chaos that comes with getting 3 little ones out the door on time. On the morning of July 6, 2003, Joni, accompanied by her mother and her 3 young children, Marcus, who had just turned 4, Lindsay, approaching 2, and the newborn Marshall, only 6 weeks old, attended their usual church service. The church offered 2 services each Sunday, one in the morning and another in the evening. The Harper family, being regulars, attended both. After the first service wrapped up, they decided to stop for a meal before heading home to recharge for the evening gathering. It seemed like a routine decision, just another Sunday like all the others. The irony, however, would soon unfold. When the evening service began, the Harper family was noticeably absent. This struck some members of the congregation as unusual, but it wasn't a cause for alarm. After all, Joni had her hands full with a newborn and 2 small children, so it wasn't far-fetched to assume she might have chosen rest over the second service. Who wouldn't want a little extra sleep after a busy morning with young kids? In hindsight, it was a simple, understandable decision, one that was tragically destined to be far more than just that. After the service, the Harper family returned home, and from that point no one had heard a word from them. 2 full days passed, and still there was no sign of Joni or Ernestine. Calls went unanswered, and concerned friends began to feel a growing unease. It was strange for the family to go silent, especially with their usual close-knit social circle. The absence, which seemed so simple at first, was beginning to cast a shadow of uncertainty over everything. 𝐀𝐫𝐜𝐳𝐭 𝐅𝐴𝐬𝐿, who shared a bond with Joni that went far beyond friendship, felt a growing need to stop by the house and see if everything was all right. On the morning of Tuesday, July 8th, 2003, just 2 days after anyone had last heard from Joni, her mother Ernestine, or the kids, 𝐂𝐫𝐳 made her way to their house. Once she stepped inside, she found herself in a deeply unsettling situation that no one ever hopes to witness firsthand. Inside the home, it was confirmed that Joni, Ernestine, Marcus, Lindsay, and little Marshall had all lost their lives. Evidence left behind, specifically small caliber casings, hinted at the method, painting a quiet but chilling picture of what had occurred. When officers reached the residence, what they walked into was unsettling and appeared deliberately disordered. The scene had been staged to suggest a burglary gone sideways. However, once they examined Joni more closely and noted an additional wound, suspicions shifted towards something far more personal, possibly driven by intense emotion rather than greed. Although the actual weapon couldn't be found at the scene, investigators concluded it had come from inside the house. A single kitchen knife was noticeably missing from the block, offering a quiet but telling clue, like the world's most unsettling game of what doesn't belong. Authorities learned that entry had been gained through the back sliding door, which surprisingly showed no damage. Despite the messy state of the home, nothing had actually been stolen. These clues led to an early conclusion. Whoever did this likely came for Joni, and not for valuables. The motive remained a mystery. Even more confounding was why innocent children, one of them just weeks into life, had also been harmed. It was the kind of heartbreak that logic couldn't explain and hope refused to understand. Once it was discovered that Joni had a husband, investigators located Vincent to inform him of the devastating loss. As her partner, he also became someone they needed to speak with, not just out of formality, but to ensure every angle was covered, as is standard in such cases. However, it was soon confirmed that Vincent hadn't been in Bakersfield at the time. He had taken a flight on July 2nd to visit his brother in Ohio and later traveled to North Carolina to spend time with his mother. When authorities reached him, he was staying in Elizabethtown, a small town tucked away in North Carolina, far from the scene and even farther from suspicion, at least for the moment. When officers in North Carolina delivered the devastating news to Vincent, his reaction, as later described by the detective present, was one of complete emotional collapse. At one point, overwhelmed by shock, he asked for a trash can, fearing he might be sick, a response as human as it was heartbreaking. During their conversation with Vincent, detectives found it difficult to gauge much beyond his emotional state. He appeared genuinely distraught, and based on the timeline, it seemed he had been far from the area when the tragedy occurred, hundreds of miles away, in fact, which made his involvement increasingly unlikely. As word of the tragedy made its way through Bakersfield, a deep sense of fear settled over the neighborhood. The thought that someone capable of taking 5 lives, 3 of them just children, might still be nearby left many residents feeling uneasy. It was the kind of fear that makes people double-check their locks and question the kindness of strangers. At first, there seemed to be no explanation, no clear suspect, no obvious motive. But as detectives began peeling back the layers of the case, it became apparent that appearances can be misleading, and sometimes the truth hides in plain sight, wearing a very convincing mask. On July 8, 2003, a tragic discovery was made inside a Bakersfield, California home. 39-year-old Joni Harper, her 70-year-old mother Ernestine, and Joni's 3 young children, Marcus, age 4, Lindsay, nearly 2, and infant Marshall, were all found deceased from gunshot wounds. The quiet neighborhood was suddenly thrust into a nightmare no one could have prepared for. Vincent Brothers, Joni's husband, assured detectives he had been far from California when the tragedy occurred. But as the investigation unfolded, it began to reveal a far darker story, one that showed just how deeply cruelty can hide behind a calm face and a well-timed plane ticket. The loss of 5 lives sent shockwaves through the Bakersfield community. Both Joni and her mother, Ernestine, were known for their kindness and involvement, admired by many. The notion that someone could enter their home and take not only their lives, but also those of Joni's young children, was something few could wrap their minds around, like a nightmare that made no sense, even after waking up. In a 2009 interview with Dateline, Eddie Harper, Joni's brother, recalled how the devastating news reached him in fragments. He explained that his cousin first called to say that something had happened to Joni and little Lindsay. Then a couple of hours later, the phone rang again, this time with even more heartbreaking news. His mother and young Marcus were also gone. The weight of the tragedy didn't hit all at once. It arrived like waves, each one worse than the last. It was only during the 3rd phone call that the entire truth became clear. No one had survived. While officers in North Carolina had already spoken with Vincent and noted what seemed to be a credible explanation for his whereabouts, doubts lingered. Despite the distance, something didn't sit right. Soon after, authorities in Bakersfield asked their counterparts across state lines to take him into custody. After spending several hours being questioned, Vincent was let go and made his way back to Bakersfield, a return that raised as many eyebrows as it did questions. Vincent remained the primary focus of the investigation, yet the situation was complicated. Not only was he reportedly on the East Coast at the time, but he also held a respected position as an elementary school principal. Much like Joni and Ernestine, he was seen as a trusted figure within the community, someone no one expected to be at the center of such a case. At first glance, nothing about Vincent suggested he could be involved in something so unthinkable, especially an act as devastating as this. As the case moved forward, investigators set out to verify whether Vincent had truly been in Ohio on the day his family lost their lives. They reviewed his financial records and found transactions dated July 6th, right in line with the timeline of when the tragedy was believed to have occurred. On paper, at least, it all pointed away from him. The activity on Vincent's credit card seemed to support his story, suggesting he had indeed been exactly where he claimed to be. As detectives continued searching for answers, the community gathered to say goodbye to Joni, Ernestine, and the children. Vincent, still under quiet scrutiny by law enforcement, was present at the funeral. He took a seat in the front row, tears streaming down, a public display of grief that raised both sympathy and suspicion. Although detectives continued to keep a watchful eye on Vincent, many, like Joni's brother Eddie, found it hard to believe he could be involved. Eddie later shared with Dateline that neither his sister nor their mother had ever mentioned Vincent having a short fuse. He also recalled that after the service, Vincent approached him directly, firmly stating that he hadn't been there and had nothing to do with what happened. Once Vincent's credit card activity seemed to back up part of his timeline, investigators widened their focus. They began to consider alternative theories. Perhaps Joni hadn't been the intended victim after all. It was possible, they thought, that Ernestine may have been the true target from the start. Given Ernestine's involvement in community advocacy, investigators considered whether her work had stirred up resentment. She had long understood that her efforts, while meaningful, might carry certain risks. In fact, she had even taken the step of purchasing a revolver, just in case her goodwill ever met someone else's bad intentions. Detectives understood that a case of this magnitude demanded a thorough approach. Every possible lead had to be explored, because whoever was behind this couldn't be allowed to disappear into the background. In the months that followed, investigators remained focused on uncovering the full picture. But the more they examined the details, the more Vincent's carefully constructed timeline began to show cracks, small at first, but hard to ignore. Though the credit card records initially supported Vincent's story, investigators took things a step further by reviewing surveillance footage from the stores where the transactions occurred. What they found changed everything. The individual seen making the purchases wasn't Vincent at all. The man on the footage turned out to be Melvin, Vincent's brother, whose similar build and stature made the substitution easy to miss, at least at first glance. Once authorities identified Melvin in the footage, they brought him in for questioning. Initially, he denied having used Vincent's credit cards, but as the interview went on, his story shifted. Eventually, Melvin acknowledged that he had made the purchases, and that his brother had given him clear instructions on what to buy. Melvin's confession marked a major turning point in the case. Investigators had now confirmed that it was Vincent's brother making the purchases tied to the alibi. Still, even with that revelation, one key question remained unanswered. Vincent could have been in Ohio too. Melvin told investigators that Vincent had been with him throughout the weekend. Vincent's attorney later explained to Dateline that sharing a credit card with his brother wasn't out of the ordinary and was simply done to help him out. According to the defense, Vincent had stayed with Melvin up until Friday, then spent the remainder of the weekend with another brother, Troy. They also claimed there were additional witnesses, unrelated to the family, who could verify his presence in Ohio. Despite those claims, investigators remained skeptical. Melvin had already been caught withholding the truth, which cast doubt on the rest of his account. And when it came to the time Vincent was supposedly with his other brother, no receipts or records existed to back it up, just words and a rapidly thinning alibi. Following their conversation with Melvin, investigators turned their attention to Vincent's movements in the days surrounding the incident. Records confirmed that on July 2nd, he had boarded a flight from California to Columbus, Ohio. After landing, he picked up a rental car and drove directly to his brother's residence. Just a family visit on paper, but investigators weren't taking anything at face value. When detectives reviewed the rental car's mileage, they found something that didn't quite add up. Over the course of just 9 days, from July 2nd to July 11th, the car had been driven more than 5,400 miles. After doing the math, investigators believed the only logical explanation was that the vehicle had made a round trip to California, a journey that, ironically, no GPS could erase. After many long months of following leads and examining evidence, detectives believed they were finally seeing the broader picture. And with each new detail, their suspicion grew stronger. They were now certain that all signs pointed to Vincent brothers. Even with a growing list of clues, investigators still lacked the critical proof needed to confirm their timeline. They suspected Vincent had booked a flight to Ohio as a cover story, only to quietly make the cross-country trip by car back to Bakersfield, carry out the unthinkable, and then return to Ohio, all without leaving a clean trail. To dig deeper into their theory, the Bakersfield Police Department teamed up with the FBI and sent the rental car in for a detailed forensic examination, specifically looking for insects that might have hitched a ride on the journey. Because certain insect species are native to specific regions, authorities hoped that traces of bugs might act as tiny, unintended travel companions and potential witnesses. So the vehicle was carefully examined and the samples were forwarded to researchers at UC Davis for analysis. When the test results were returned, entomologists had identified multiple insect species that were native solely to California and the western regions beyond the Rockies. It seemed even the bugs had a better sense of direction than some suspects. Investigators were steadily closing in. From the outset, their attention had been on Vincent, and now the trail of clues they uncovered was drawing a clear line in his direction, almost as if the evidence itself had chosen a favorite suspect. In addition to the physical clues being pieced together, investigators also reviewed Vincent's history, and what they found raised even more concern. It turned out that there had been past allegations of abusive behavior, casting an unsettling light on the man who once appeared so composed. Back in 1988, while still with his first wife, records show that Vincent was found guilty of a misdemeanor related to domestic abuse. He ended up spending nearly a week behind bars, a short stay, but one that quietly marked the beginning of a troubling pattern. Following the end of his first marriage, Vincent entered into a second one in 1992. However, that relationship unraveled quickly. Within a year, his wife filed for divorce, claiming she feared for her safety and alleged that Vincent had made disturbing threats toward her, a sharp contrast to the public image he had maintained. In 1996, during his time as a vice principal, Vincent faced serious allegations from a colleague who visited his home. According to her account, he became physically aggressive, forced her into a room, and took photos without her consent. When she tried to call for help, she claimed the phone was pulled from her grasp, an encounter that painted a deeply unsettling picture behind an otherwise professional facade. Following the incident, she said she attempted to file a complaint with law enforcement. However, according to her, officers seemed reluctant to take it seriously, suggesting that Vincent's standing in the community may have played a role in their hesitation. It's a sad twist when a polished resume appears to hold more weight than someone's plea for help. Once she had walked away from the situation, she mentioned making an attempt to involve the authorities. However, due to how highly regarded Vincent was in the community, she claimed the officers subtly steered her away from pursuing any official complaint, almost as if his reputation had already filed a defense on his behalf. While working at the reception desk of a local school, she reported ongoing discomfort due to Vincent's unwanted attention, both in person and through unexpected calls to her home. Over time, the situation became so overwhelming that she decided to step away from her position, citing an environment that had grown tense and difficult to endure. Ironically, the very place meant to foster learning and safety had turned into the reason she needed a break. The district acknowledged receiving her reports and stated that an internal review had been conducted. Vincent was cautioned regarding his conduct, but no official disciplinary action followed. In a twist that felt more like a poorly written policy memo than justice, the matter was quietly closed, filed under resolved, though nothing truly was. Following months of careful investigation into the tragic loss of the Harper family, law enforcement came to a grim conclusion. Vincent Brothers was identified as the primary suspect. Officials felt confident that the facts collected painted a compelling picture. Unfortunately, it was the kind of portrait no one would want hanging in their hallway. In April of 2004, Vincent Brothers was taken into custody. According to authorities, at the time of his arrest, there were signs he might have been preparing to disappear. He was liquidating belongings and had listed his home for sale. It was as if he thought a fresh start could be squeezed in before the handcuffs arrived. To many, the news of Vincent's arrest, especially given his role as an elementary school principal, was almost impossible to process. Those closest to him struggled to align the accusations with the person they thought they knew. How could the man who offered high fives at morning drop-off and gave life advice in the lunchroom be accused of such an unthinkable act? It was the kind of contradiction that left an entire community trying to make sense of the senseless. The trial began in January 2007. It would span 4 months and include testimony from over 100 individuals, Vincent among them. Though the case built by prosecutors relied on indirect evidence, it was methodically constructed. They walked the jury through a timeline they believed showed Vincent making the long drive back to Bakersfield with a deadly purpose. The defense, on the other hand, focused on casting doubt. They claimed Vincent had remained in Ohio the entire time and highlighted inconsistencies in the rental car records, pointing out that odometer data wasn't always reliably entered. Apparently, even numbers can have bad days. The defense maintained that the timeline presented by prosecutors simply didn't add up, that making a round trip to California in that span was unrealistic, if not outright impossible. Their strategy hinged on dismantling the prosecution's version of events, insisting it couldn't have happened the way it was described. But despite their efforts, the jury remained unconvinced. After 3 days of weighing the evidence, the verdict was unanimous. Vincent was found guilty across the board. By September 2007, a death sentence had been handed down. Today, Vincent Brothers remains on death row at San Quentin. A long chapter closed, though the ending still feels surreal. It's almost impossible to comprehend an act so heartless, one that could take the lives of 3 generations under a single roof. No explanation ever feels big enough to fit a crime that small children couldn't even understand. The loss was devastating and irrational, and there's no outcome that truly balances the scale. To this day, some who once stood by Vincent still struggle to accept the verdict, wondering if the right person was held accountable. But for the loved ones of Joni and Ernestine, the decision brought a sense of closure and a belief that justice at last found its mark.